Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So last week during our snow day here, I turned on NPR and listened to Krista Tippett's On Being as kind of as a substitute for worship, and was enthralled that she had on the sociologist Brene Brown, who's talking about the relationship between courage and vulnerability. Courage and vulnerability. We don't often think about those two going together. We think courage is courageous acts, right? But really, if you think about your last courageous act, or the one before that, or the one before that, when has vulnerability not been a part of it? There's this interesting phenomenon. We try to, whenever we arise in life in a way that marks us, that makes us who we are as fully human and fully ourselves, it takes an act of courage because life has a way of hurting us. The world has a way of striking back at people who kind of raise their heads above the radar and appear in the world in ways that are distinctive. So most of us, we try to kind of stay below the radar so that the world doesn't notice us, so believing that it won't hurt us in some way. But those marks that really define who we are, make us the distinctive human beings that we are always those kind of above the radar acts where we stand tall and firmly and say, I'm connected to a joy that is so deep it does not matter how the world responds. Come hell or high water, this is who I am, this is what I believe, and this is how I act. It's those precious moments that are reflected actually in our two passages this morning you'll hear. These two passages which you'll hear concern miracle stories of Jesus. And a lot of us have trouble, like with miracles, like did they really happen that way or not? But bottom line, what miracle stories in the Bible often do is they put us in the position of where we are called to acts of courage and vulnerability in ways that help us define our own identity as people of God and as human beings. Once more, helping us to explore these passages are two faith communities from the Tri-Faith Initiative, represented by Rabbi Azrael and Dr. Syed Muhaddin. Rabbi Azrael's back. He keeps hoping to be here, and then it's just not healing fast enough, but he swore on the Torah to me that he'll be here next week in person. Until then, we have him by video. But we do have, once again, in person, Dr. Muhaddin. I'd like to invite you for this time, who is the leader of the Islamic Institute, who is the Tri-Faith community who will be locating at 132nd and Pacific Street. Thank you for joining us once again. And before we listen to our first passage and kind of have some comment on that, I wanted to also acknowledge that I know in the last week or so, quite a number of people in our congregation received an anonymous letter that was hand-addressed to them that was written either by or on behalf of a fundamentalist Christian group in Omaha named the Global Faith Institute. And people have been asking questions about that. This group has been trying to kind of undermine the Tri-Faith Initiative by trying to draw these rather wild parallels between Islamic extremism that's happening out there and our own local community. And I know that those of us at Countryside and those of us at Temple Israel, any of us who have spent even minimal time with you and your faith community, find that rather highly ironic that the people who are standing most firmly above the radar making statement against violence and for inclusivity of these great Abrahamic faiths are the very ones being targeted by this group. But I thought, since you were here, do you have any personal comment on
this has been going on for some time, and this global faith group periodically comes to life whenever they feel that something happens to further the initiative to increase the chances of that we actually will have three places of worship in one place, which has never happened in the history of the world. This would be a unique opportunity. And it seems to sort of bother them when they come up with all kinds of stories which are totally incorrect. all the three groups are local, and especially I can say on behalf of the Islamic Institute that it is founded by and is funded by the local people in Omaha, and is fully and has no outside connections or support from any other group. So I think their purpose is to just produce confusion and misinformation, and those who know what reality is should not have any effect on them.
Yeah. Well, I'm just glad that the rest of the world seems to be catching on. I noticed in the Huffington Post this last week, an article came out that named the Tri-Faith Initiative, which you helped found, as one of the 8 most important interfaith monuments in the world. And that included like the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul.
As I said to my family when I saw that, it took my breath away to be in the same list as Church of Bethlehem.
Absolutely. When I read the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was on that list, and the Tri-Faith, I mean, that is the most sacred place, church in all of Christianity. That's the place where people feel that Jesus was raised from the dead. And we got that and the Tri-Faith Initiative. Pretty good company you're keeping.
Indeed. and the church, that church was just mentioned, is actually guarded by 2 Muslim families for the last 1,000 years.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, Chris is going to read our first passage, which has to do with a little food.
A little food. From Matthew chapter 14. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children.
So once again, I want to defer to our elder brother in the faith, not in physical age necessarily, but in the age of the faith, Rabbi Azrael. Here's what he had to say about the relationship between Judaism and the passage we just heard. Rabbi Azrael, as we look at this miracle story of the feeding the 5,000, how does this operate? How does this strike you from the eyes of your tradition?
So it was very interesting because we too have miracles that are happening in the desert. I mean, this is the initiation of the prophets that are at the focal point of our religion. So we have all kind of stuff happening during the 40 years in the desert. So the loaves reminded me of the manna that poured out from heaven. But you have bitter water constantly through the desert. There is a place where Moses throws a piece of wood that makes the water sweet. I think that the miracles or the stories that are coming in the Jewish tradition, they're there to highlight 3 major concepts. And I think they need to be supported by those stories. So there is, of course, the center of creationism, or the creation of the world. You have the revelation, which takes place on Mount Sinai. And then, of course, you have redemption. Redemption is this ability of crossing the Sea of Reed. So I think all of the miracles that we call miracle, because I'm looking for another word for miracles that we can use so it doesn't scare our people. I think there is some kind of an aversion in our congregations for the word miracle. I think when we say miracle, we expect similar miracles to the level of the Torah and the Scripture and the New Testament or the Quran. And I don't think we'll never find those kind of stories. So the stories in the desert, the manna, the parting of the Sea of Reeds, or walking on water, or walking on dry land, those are there to support the concepts I suggested, to explain to us the motive of creation, to tell us what exactly is revelation, what it's all about, and then, of course, this ability to celebrate the redemption. In Exodus chapter 14, God says to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward." So the way we look at the parting of the Red Sea is definitely the way Cecil B. DeMille does not portray. There was no miracle there. It never happened. What happened was the ability of few individuals to start walking into the sea. And this is really a parallel story that we have in our tradition. A guy by the name of Nachshon decided that he's tired of listening to Moses praying. And why not to do something on your own? And he really moved away the prayers and started walking, letting God in through the walking. And only when the water got to his neck, only then the water, according to tradition, separated. So I think that all of the stories in our traditions are there to support larger concepts that we need to pay attention. It's not about the miracle. It's about the story and the faith that is surrounding that miracle.
Talking about courage and vulnerability, I love that Midrashic story about Nashon walking into the Red Sea until he's up to his neck, and that's what triggers the water. How about within Islam?
In Islam, the concept of sharing, which this story carries, is crucial. That God has mentioned in Quran over 100 times how important it is to share your wealth or your belongings or whatever you have with other people who need. And God also promises, similar to what happened in the story of Jesus Christ, that it will multiply. God uses a parable that when a peasant or farmer sows his field, and every grain has 7 years, and each year has over 1,000 grains, and that's how you're doing good, being just, and sharing your wealth with the other people will multiply. So the parable which you heard has very similar findings, that what your responsibility is to your human beings, the ability to respond to the call of God is the real faith.
And I understand in Islam too there is the concept of zakat.
There are two charitable concepts in Quran or in Islam. One is a zakat, which is your part of our pillars of faith, that you are responsible for your fellow beings, therefore you must give a certain amount of your income yearly to that cause. But there is another aspect of charity which is called sadaqah, which is you give willingly without any being a requirement of your religion, and that is what Quran repeatedly asks you to do.
I see that very much in operation in the story of the feeding of the 5,000. I interpret it a little differently than some. But I think that there was a miracle in that story, but not the one that we expect. I mean, Jesus was not like pulling rabbits out of hats, like magically multiplying loaves and fishes. When I think back to the time period in which that story comes from, imagine a whole crowd like us going out into the desert, and Jesus is preaching, and he keeps preaching, and he keeps preaching, and people are getting hungry, and pretty soon the disciples are like, hey, how are we going to feed them? And Jesus says, well, go ahead and feed them. And he's like, well, there's not a Hy-Vee or a quick stop for 100 miles from here. How are we going to feed them? And he takes out, he's got the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes and begins to distribute this. But you think about that time period, any of us, if we were going out into the wilderness and knew we were going out to the wilderness, knew that there was no Hy-Vee, knew that there was no 7-Eleven out there, what would we be doing? We'd be packing along our peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and a little water for sure. We'd have that, but would we necessarily be making a show of the fact that we had it? Well, probably not, because we all know people who don't plan ahead. And they're going to be seeing our peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and saying, oh, I forgot mine, can I have yours? Or can I have part of yours? And, worrying about, well, will there be enough for me and my family? Can I feed my children if I have to share? Jesus is very much aware of all this. So he makes this very big public display of taking the very little that he has, than his disciples, and sharing it extravagantly with others. Well, what are you going to do when you see that? Okay, I got a little something here too. Oh, you got something too. And pretty soon everybody, by letting go of that which they were so afraid to share, by actually letting go, they discovered they had more than enough. I think that the whole story is very much meant to illustrate that principle that you've been talking about.
And actually in Islam there is a hadith which says that the great impulse of magnanimity and willing to share, and the impulse to answer the call of God is the true faith.
It's beautiful. Well, we have one more story, the story of Peter, who's referred to by name as Peter, but his name was actually Simon before it was renamed Peter after the story takes place. Peter, incidentally, means rock, and that may have some significance in this story.
Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately, reaching out his hand, caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God."
Well, let's hear from Rabbi Azrael on walking on water.
Thank you very much for this invitation. I enjoy it. I'm waiting week to week to receive the material from you so we can create this kind of communication. And I thank your congregation that are willing to listen to me and Dr. Mohadin week after week.
Pleasure. Well, as you look at this story of this attempt to walk on water from Peter, how does that kind of reverberate through your eyes?
Well, I think that sometimes we need to suspend wherever we are and do things even if they are completely different than what we are used to. I think sometimes we go into those routines and forget to admit that there is there that we need to get to. And the question is how to get there. Again, the narrowing of the ego and being able to understand the eternal self inside of us is what we need to do. And there is a constant struggle between those two forces inside of us. I'm very much interested in discovering the eternal self that is in us, to be able to then crash as much as we can some of this extra ego that we pride ourselves I'm not suggesting to get rid of it completely, but I think we need to reduce some of this other power that prevents us of opening our eyes and seeing miracles constantly happening throughout our lives.
Yeah. And you mentioned there's this, Peter, Simon was renamed Peter, rock, and that rock has some resonance in the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, we have a lot of rocks. The rock is the name that we call our God. God has about 90 or 100 names in Jewish tradition. One of them is the rock. So we pray to the rock, rock of ages, rock of Israel. There is something solid, something that is permanent, something that can never be removed. All the rest of our life is transient. And so this desire to be able to create a foundation for oneself and for one's religion and for one's church or synagogue or a mosque on a solid foundation, on a serious rock, it's something very, very powerful in our tradition. We also call God the place, hamakom. Hamakom means just the place. So you need to have the place. And you can find a place if you just search for this. Similar to finding the rock that you can establish your faith on it.
And wasn't there a rock that was kind of prominent in the exile, in the wilderness wanderings that Moses is struck for fresh?
Yeah. This is the moment I think of deep frustration, which sometimes clergy have. Not, of course, not you or me or Dr. Mohadin, but a place where you're lost in the demands on the part of the crowd, and you want to satisfy everyone, and you want to make everyone happy, and then you forget for a moment that there is something larger. And so Moses is standing with Aaron in front of a rock, and the demands are becoming louder and louder. Give us water, give us water. And Moses forgets for a second and becomes extremely vulnerable by becoming again a human, by hitting the rock not once but twice, and actually water came. But then he got a cold shower from God, according to the text. This is the reason, one of the reasons, the major reason why Moses never made it to the promised land. Because at a moment that he needed to exalt God and testify about God, he testified about him and the hand and the rod and the violence that produced the water. Instead of just talking and finding words that are peaceful words, words that are calming in order to create the same results and get the water. Which, by the way, water in the desert is the requirement to find knowledge. So every time you read in the story of the wandering in the desert about water, it's never about water. It's about fresh wisdom that needs to come to the exiled people from Egypt. That's why they were not ready. It took a long, long time to get there.
Syed, how does the story reverberate?
It's interesting that both water and rock keeps coming up in all the three biblical and the Abrahamic religions. The story of the Prophet Abraham sacrificing his son, or in the other story which is in both in Islamic and Jewish tradition is Hajara, the mother of Ismail, trying to find water and running between two rocks to find water. And again, I think what Rabbi Azrael just said is the water seems to be equivalent of new knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And also the importance of rocks seems to be important and seems to have a symbolic importance that there is a rock which is at the base of Kaaba, the most holiest place in Islam. And that rock seems to have, has the tradition of being delivered from heaven and is a reminder of us where we came from.
That's in Mecca.
In Mecca.
Yeah.
And the other, the story about Peter and walking in water, and the trust in God and belief is also fundamental to the three Abrahamic religions. If you remember these stories, which are both repeated in Bible as well as in Quran, is the story of, again, as I mentioned earlier, Prophet Abraham having the courage to obey the Lord's command to sacrifice his son, which indicates complete trust in God's commands. And the other is the story of mother of Moses, who was willing to put her infant son in river Nile without fear of what's going to happen to him. So those are the examples of trust in God. Those are the certainty of faith.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, when I look at this story, Peter on the water through the eyes formed in my own tradition, I think, oh my gosh, that this could a human being walk on water? I don't know, but what the story really hits me between the eyes. I think about even how the story illustrates, I think, the humor of Jesus. And I've had the feeling that Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad all had some pretty profound sense of humor that just doesn't translate well in writing. I mean, you can't capture humor very well. But in this story is one of those examples, I think, of Jesus' humor, because Simon sinks like a rock in the Sea of Galilee, and next thing we know, Jesus is saying, "Hey, Simon, I got a new name for you. We're going to call you Rock." I mean, can you just imagine the disciples just bursting out and laughing? Yeah, we're going to call you Rock from now on. And then suddenly Jesus gets serious, and he says, "And upon this rock I will found my church." And Christians have taken that concept to mean like, this impregnable rock that, we build doctrines and dogmas that are supposed to stand for all time, for all people, for all places. And we build these edifices based on sacrificing your knowledge and your intellect, to unaltering creeds and infallible scriptures. And yet Jesus seems to have wanted to build his church not on this solid, unchanging rock, but on a sinking rock. And I think the deep wisdom of that story is this story illustrates the heart of the heart of the heart of religious experience. We may not be able to relate to walking on water, but can't we all relate to those times when the seas are a storm in our lives? And yet we're kind of in our comfortable little boat, and we got our friends with us, so we're safe and comfortable. And isn't it just like Jesus to appear and call us out onto the water, to step out of our comfort zone, out onto the stormy seas? And just on those rare moments when we work up the courage and maybe even realize some initial success in following that sense of call, then suddenly we're out there, we realize, what on earth have I got myself into? And we freak out, like, oh, am I just crazy for doing this or what? And we lose our faith, we lose our confidence, and like Peter, hopefully then we reach out and cry out, "Save me!" And we find our hands grasped. We find that we have not died, everything has not crashed and burned, that we are actually perfectly safe, and we're led back to our boat. But it's never the same boat after that. Once you've become convinced that you can actually follow with courage a sense of call and be safe, then you're never so stuck in that boat again the next time you hear the call.
Absolutely. The security really belongs to those who believe.
Yeah. And I think that's where all the faith traditions really come together and came together on these three stories. It just takes a little bit of faith, goes a long way. And here we have one story where Jesus asks for an audacious act, and people act, and they succeed. This miracle of everybody being fed. The second story, Jesus asks for an audacious act, and there's a failure. And yet, this becomes the whole symbol of his whole community, which tells me that ultimately both stories are about having that sense of courage in the midst of our vulnerability, to know that we can answer the call and that we can succeed or we can fail, and yet God's purposes are still worked out. Well, Dr. Muhyiddin, we thank you so much for joining us once again. I know we have one last week together, and also I thank you. Also, I know you're willing to stick around afterwards for a couple of minutes. I know we're all hoping to wind up in the gym afterwards to hear to take part in the additional conversations with Ali Pointer Macchietto about our building. But if anybody has questions about that letter I've referred to earlier, we're going to stick around for maybe 5-10 minutes most, he and I, after the service, and we'll answer any questions you may have about that. So thank you once again, Dr. Mulhideen, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.